Yeah, so today's session will be global drivers for sustainable aviation fuel acceleration and drivers for developing a domestic industry. Just a little bit of introduction about U.S. Grains Council. We are a private, non-profit partnership of agribusinesses and producers committed to building and expanding the international use of coarse grains and their co-products, including ethanol. And we work with partners globally to expand the market for fuel industry use ethanol. And in the Council, we believe that ethanol use is vital to global economic development and environmental sustainability. And we have a global network of offices all across the world. I'm based in Singapore, and my regional office is in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and our head office is in Washington, D.C. And in U.S. Grains Council, we actually promote ethanol around the world. We demonstrate the environmental and human benefits, human health benefits of implementing ethanol into the gasoline pool especially, and working with government and local stakeholders to develop policies for increased use of ethanol globally. And we address trade barriers, logistical constraints to imports, etc., and we show ethanol's value as a source of high-octane, low-carbon fuel. And for us, on the Global Sustainable Aviation Programming, we actually support and the development of government sustainable aviation fuel roadmaps. We advise national oil companies on like alcohol-to-jet technology investment and implementation, and we do global and regional SAF, ATJ conferences and study missions, and we do like work with COSIA on the methodology with ICAO, etc. And we have global media and consumer education initiative. And the U.S. Grains Council collaborates with local industry, government, and multilaterals to support an expanded use of biofuels globally. And these are some of the organizations that we work with across the globe. Now, decarbonizing the aviation industry, I think that's a big part. Aviation is one of the most challenging industry to decarbonize right now. It contributes about 2.5% of the world's total carbon. And generally, sustainable aviation produces up to 80% less carbon emission over its life cycle compared to conventional jet fuel. And it can be used in today's fueling infrastructure and aircraft engines without any modifications, or up to 50% at least. Currently, there's an increase in global uptake of sustainable aviation fuel, particularly in Europe and UK and the United States. Despite a commitment to high SAF volume targets and aggressive adoption timelines, limited global production means demand will definitely surpass supply. So the key questions remain around affordability, sustainability, as well as competition for feedstocks and economically efficient skills of production. And Australia could play a key role, both as a source of feedstock and as a SAF producer itself, with Australia already producing significant quantities of feedstock, as we have heard, exported for biofuels productions. The country is well positioned to expand this into a diversified portfolio of feedstock supplies. And with numerous feedstock and technologies to choose from, what are Australia's most suitable SAF production option to help develop its SAF capability? And how can stakeholders like airlines, industry itself, government can help drive forward this adoption? And with this, we move into today's session. So we have five speakers today. So Alastair Blanshard from ICF will join us from online, and then we're followed by Emma Wilson for Airlines for Australia and New Zealand, talking about the Maximizing Australian Airlines contribution to net zero. And we've got Graeme Potger from Qantas on responding to the global push for SAF acceleration, and Dott from Virgin Australia about bridging the gap to deliver sustainable aviation fuel. James Williamson from Neste, Australia, will talk about the current and future role of fats and oils. And we've got Flyn van Ewijk from LanzaJet talking about alcohol-to-jet projects leading the way. So we'll save the questions for at the end, where I'll invite all the speakers back up later on to have a Q&A session. So with that, we'll invite Alastair Blanshard, who will join us online today.
Good morning. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So it's a real pleasure to be presenting this morning from Spain, and I'm just very sorry that I couldn't make it out there in person, but happy that my colleague Jane did and is out there somewhere in the audience. So good morning for all of you. So my name is Alastair Blanshard, and I lead a team at a consultancy called ICF, where I work to try and make aviation more sustainable. And of course, low carbon fuels are just the most important measure that we have to decarbonize the aviation industry, as we just heard. And so they've been a huge focus for our work for nearly 2 decades now. And today, across the team, that includes projects to implement the refuel mandates in Europe. And of course, that's really kind of accelerating as we get very close to the start of the mandate in just a month and a half. Looking a lot at the Jet Zero strategy in the UK, a lot of the state and federal policies in the US, and more recently projects in Japan and of course Australia. And for us, we're really excited to be invited to speak this morning, and especially because a lot of the work that we do in countries like the US and UK, there's a lot of legacy baggage from a lot of the policies where, in many cases, these policies were implemented a decade or even 2 decades ago, often at a time when there was very different objectives for low carbon fuels, and also technology was in a really different place. And so for us, we're super excited about the opportunity for Australia to leapfrog a lot of the challenges that we've seen in these legacy countries and build a better, more sustainable industry at a lot faster than we've seen in other countries. And I'm very conscious I'm the first presenter in that block, and there's some really impressive speakers coming up after me. So I've tried to keep my presentation quite high level, really just touching on 3 main themes. So firstly, starting off with where we are today with the low carbon fuels industry, looking at a global perspective. Secondly, some of the key challenges that we still have to solve. And then thirdly, looking at some of the principles of the next steps as Australia continues to build on a lot of the successes with the recent facility announcements, the considerable supportive policies and packages that have been announced, and of course the ongoing SAF mandate consultation. So looking at some of the keys to success for that. So just going straight in, so looking at where we are today. And so what this diagram is showing us is just kind of the size of the industry, both historically and then looking forward. So those blue dots in the middle is the size of the production and consumption in the SAF industry. And you can really see it growing from that tiny kind of origin back in 2019 of 0.02 million tons up to about 500,000 tons of global SAF production and consumption last year. The ICF forecast, we expect it at the moment with the announced policies and technologies to reach about 20 million tons by 2030. And then of course scaling up beyond that as we look to decarbonize the industry. And for us, there's 2 really important things that this kind of diagram tells us. And the first is that when we look at the SAF industry, it's a new industry, but it's not that new. And when we look at a lot of the work that's gone on, there's this really considerable foundation that's been built over about a decade and a half in the SAF industry. That the first flight using a sustainable aviation fuel was back in 2008. The first ASTM pathway was certified in 2009. And today there's been over 500,000 flights that have used a blend of SAF. And that's really shown us that SAF is safe and sustainable. And that foundation has given us this incredible basis to scale the industry. And that's the second point, is this incredible scaling that we're going through today. So as we pivot from that 500,000 tons last year, as we start to see it growing at a really impressive pace over the next few years, and that kind of translates into adding about 2.8 million tons of capacity every year between now and 2030. And of course, that's really driven by a lot of those supportive policies in, especially the UK and EU, as we start to see the mandates kicking in just a couple of months' time. And of course, the industrial policies in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, kind of driving a lot of that, supported by a lot of the state policies. And just to put that into context a little bit, so 2.8 million tons is just under half of the fossil jet consumption of Australia today. So what this would physically look like is that just 2 years' time, in just 2 years, you could physically replace the entire fossil jet consumption of Australia at a global level. And so for us, that's kind of the two kind of important things, is that there's been this incredible work trying to build this foundation for the industry over the last decade. And then secondly is that the next couple of years are really not going to look like the past, that there's this incredible tick up in investment in facilities. And of course, when you think about 2.8 million tons, the investment and just the jobs that's driving behind the scenes. And so this is for us is a really positive story, that we're at this really exciting stage of the industry where we're starting to see it kind of really accelerate and really take off. But of course, there's a lot of challenges to solve, and particularly when we look out longer term, the really considerable scaling, like 20 million tons by 2030 translates to just under 5% of the global jet fuel consumption. So it's when you look at it in absolute terms, it's a huge amount of low carbon fuel. But when you look at it at the global level, it still falls short of our global ambitions, and particularly when we look longer term out to the decarbonization by 2050. And so in our minds, there's three kind of key challenges that we still have to look at, and I tried to kind of put them out here. And the first is, at the risk of being flippant, is that there's just not enough policy coverage. With those global policies really kind of led by the existing policies that have been in progress for a good few years now, that will drive us to about that 5% SAF by 2030, and that falls short of our targets. Aviation is an industry with famously thin and volatile margins. SAF is a very expensive fuel, and so policy is super important to close the gap. And while the voluntary market has been really important to scale the industry to the stage that it is today, we really see the voluntary market often closes and complements gaps in policies and allows us to go faster and adds depth to the policies. But voluntary measures don't replace the policy, don't replace government policy. And so from a very blunt statement, we won't be able to scale an industry without policy. And the second point that I just wanted to make actually falls out from underneath that. And this is kind of looking at risk and the relationship with price. And so as soon as we start talking with policy, we often see that there's a very adversarial relationship where often everybody wants SAF, and frankly, everybody wants someone else to pay for SAF. And that can sometimes make it quite a tricky discussion when you start getting into policies. But I think for us, there's a really important point that when we look at the industry from an investor's perspective, and we spend quite a lot of time working with investors looking to build facilities and other infrastructure across the industry, but this is a really challenging industry to invest money in, and especially when the facilities are often $1 billion or $1.5 billion of US dollars per facility, is a huge investment to make as well. And when you compound the risk across the technology challenges, that they're very complex facilities, the policy challenges, you need to know that someone's going to buy your product. You need to know that they're going to pay you an appropriate price for the product. That compounds to create a huge amount of risk. And of course, risk means that you need to then charge a very high cost of capital. You need to have a very significant risk premium. And for us, this is one of the really incredible opportunities for effective policy, is that it doesn't just kind of address and close the price gap and make a fair market, but it can also address that risk premium. And reducing the risk premium makes the SAF cheaper for everybody. And so for us, it's a really exciting opportunity for effective policy where everyone can benefit. And just to give an example of that, actually, the UK offshore wind industry and the contracts for difference, or CFD programs that they use, are a really interesting example of this, where in recent years, the program sets strike prices, and this is done through an auction process where project developers will bid to receive a fixed price for the electricity that they produce. And that fixed price is called the strike price. And in recent years, we've actually seen that auction going to lower than market rates. So in other words, we're seeing producers saying that they will sell electricity for less than the market would pay them for that electricity if they get a reduced volatility for that. And so, of course, that's a really great example of where effective policy benefits everybody, where the producers get to have a steady and less volatile return on their investment, but customers, and that includes the population of the UK, get a cheaper access to electricity, cheaper than the market price. And so that's kind of a really good example of where effective policy can benefit everybody. It's not just about who pays; it's about reducing the price across all stakeholders. And the third point is just the kind of balance between the technologies that we have today and the technologies that we need to scale the industry. And of course, like the industry that we've built today is really built on a lot of what I would call the easier feedstocks. So the oil seeds, for example, waste fats, oils, and greases, and a really important kind of basis around ethanol as well. And of course, we're seeing that in some of the other presentations. And these kind of liquid, high energy density feedstocks form the absolute basis, and they're going to be critical to the industry today, they're going to absolutely dominate it over the next decade, and they'll be a really important foundation for the industry going into the next years. But as we kind of look longer term, and as we look at the scaling that we need to fully decarbonize the aviation industry, that's going to require us to scale to much beyond the capability of these feedstocks. And so that means scaling into feedstocks like cellulosic ethanols, green hydrogen, for example. And one of the challenges that we have is that the technologies to convert these into a sustainable fuel are more sustainable, but they're also much more expensive today, and they can't compete in a level playing field with HEFA. And so when we look at effective policy, there's a real important element of it, which is trying to balance the decarbonization today. So using HEFAs, oilseeds, ethanols, for example, first generation ethanols, with the need to develop the technologies for the longer term decarbonization. And so then just going into kind of a little bit more detail, like when we think about these policies, we often like to kind of separate it into two kind of buckets. And this means that on one hand, thinking about the environmental policy. And so, for example, this is elements to create demand for low carbon fuels to decarbonize, to reduce emissions. And on the other hand, the industrial policy. And this is thinking much more about feedstocks, factories, and jobs. And one of the kind of critical factors that we really see for effective policy is when both sides of this are balanced. So when you both have stakeholders working on the industrial side with stakeholders working on the environmental side and pushing in the same direction. And this is a really important element because when these sides are both balanced, that creates a huge amount of social support, and that creates a lot of resilience for these policies. And that resilience and stability, that comes back to the point I was making about the importance of having a policy that's trustworthy, that you can invest billions of dollars against. And when you have that confidence, you can then reduce the risk premium and everybody benefits as well. And I think a really interesting point on this as well is, and thinking about it in the Australian context, is the difference that we're seeing in other countries between this implemented at the national level and the local level. And to compare the EU and the US as an example, we actually see them as both doing exactly the same thing, just at kind of opposite scales. And so, for example, in the EU, a lot of the environmental policy is driven at the EU level. And so this is through schemes like what's called Refuel, which is the SAF blending mandate that's starting in a month and a half. The ETS as well is a very important policy, and there's a lot of interaction between the two. And that's done across all member states at a fairly kind of unified level. But then the industrial policy is pushed down to the member state level, where you see individual governments supporting facilities, factories, producers, and others. And then in the US, you both have a similar relationship, but entirely the opposite way around. So the industrial policy is driven at the federal level. You see that through the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits and kind of a number of other supportive policies. But the environmental policy is driven down to the individual state level. So we see that, for example, with the low carbon fuel standards in California, Oregon, Washington, in development in a couple of other states as well. And it's this interaction between the industrial policies and environmental policy that for us kind of balancing both bits, both looking to kind of drive the decarbonization, but also to create the jobs, the facilities, and those local benefits, and balancing these two needs is a really important part to then get stakeholders working together to create the resilience of those policies and the resulting stability and low cost. So kind of pulling all of that together and just kind of closing out the presentation, I think for us there's really four kind of guiding principles that we'd like to focus on. And the first is that there isn't just one policy that kind of is the crucial key to kind of build a market like this. It really has to be a combination of multiple policies trying to achieve kind of multiple and different objectives within that. And that includes particularly some on the demand side. So thinking about creating that environmental policy, and then also policies on the supply side. So ensuring that the supply can meet that demand, that we're looking at the industrial strategy and the jobs and facilities associated with that. And the second is this really crucial point about the long-term certainty. And that's long-term certainty that the policy will be there, the market will be there, the market will pay an appropriate price for it, and there's an appropriate kind of legal backstop to the policies themselves. And so that kind of sits on a whole load of things. And for us, this is kind of one of the real challenges in a lot of the policy environments in other countries that, to give an example, like the EU policy, it guarantees a market through the refuel, but there's no guaranteed price under the mandate. In the US, you kind of have the opposite challenge where the individual tax credits guarantee a reasonably kind of well-known price for a lot of the production, but they're often quite short-term. And while they have been renewed, there's no guarantee often going into the future that they have. And that, in turn, both of those dynamics drive up the risk premium and the cost for all stakeholders. The third point is around this transition element of it, that progress and perfection are a really important trade-off when we look at SAF. And we want to build the SAF industry today using the feedstocks that we have available, the technologies that are commercially mature. But we also want to scale it using harder technologies like cellulosic ethanols and green hydrogen. And so balancing that need for decarbonization today through to progress towards more sustainable, more
recording in
scalable
progress
feedstocks is a really important kind of element of policies. And then a last point as well is that SAF is just one part of the low carbon fuels industry, and of course, it's impossible to build a facility that only produces SAF. Every single sustainable aviation fuel facility will also produce a portion of often renewable diesel and naphtha, depending on the product slate, and kind of the incentives and use of the other fuels, and kind of their opportunity to drive decarbonization across other sectors, whether that's in long-distance trucking or mining or products and petrochemicals production, is a super kind of important element to kind of building that coalition of support. And so ensuring that it's not just about SAF, it really is kind of looking across all low carbon fuels is a super important part for us around that alignment. So I think for me today, I've used up my little 15-minute slot. So it's been a real pleasure, and thank you very much for bearing with me, and apologies again for dialing in to speak, but hopefully that was a useful kind of quick run through. I'd love to talk to anyone if you have any questions, and you can see my email address is there on screen, or do catch up with my colleague Jane, who I think I can just see sitting there in the audience. So thank you very much, and I'll look forward to seeing the remaining presentations.
So thanks, Kent, for the introduction, and to Alastair for his presentation. I'll be also referencing some of the excellent work that ICF has done recently as part of my presentation. So I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional custodians on the land from which I'm speaking from today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and extend that respect to First Nations people present in the audience today. As Kat mentioned, I'm Emma, the CEO of Airlines for Australia and New Zealand, or AFA ANZ. And as you may know, AFA ANZ's an industry group representing airlines based in Australia and New Zealand. I think I'm coming to you today at a good time in the program. We've heard from Brendan on the work that the federal government is doing on low carbon liquid fuels and their role in helping many of our sectors of our economy reach net zero. And we've had Alastair give us a comprehensive rundown of the global SAF policy environment. So I'm here today to talk about how to maximise Australian Airlines' contribution to net zero, specifically through the use of SAF, and to provide a brief overview of the expected benefits from maximising the role of SAF in the Australian aviation sector's energy transition. I think it's safe to say that between Brendan, James, and this session, absolutely no one here will be left wondering about the benefits of a domestic SAF industry. So these reports are just a snapshot of the immense amount of work that's been done by industry and CSIRO over the last few years to understand both the role of SAF in decarbonising aviation in the aviation sector in Australia and Australia's comparative advantage as a SAF producer. The last report up on screen from ICF on behalf of the Qantas Group and Airbus was released in November last year. And I think you'll agree that even in the time since that report was released, an incredible amount of progress has been made in the low carbon liquid fuel sector in Australia. As Brendan said, for SAF specifically, we've had the formation of the Jet Zero Council, the release of the Aviation White Paper, and the consultation on low carbon liquid fuels. We very much welcome this progress, as aviation has few options to decarbonise, and to the surprise of no one in this room, we're an extremely hard to electrify sector. So in order to have a clear idea of how Australia's aviation sector can decarbonise, and the role of SAF, it's important to understand our emissions profile, particularly as our flying looks a little bit different to most other countries. In Australia, 70% of airline emissions are from international flights, and we know that these will remain reliant on liquid fuels past 2050 and for generations to come. And of the remaining 30% of our emissions, which are attributable to domestic flying, almost 90% of these flights are out of scope for electric or hydrogen aircraft, as they carry over 100 passengers or have flight times in excess of an hour. So even a short flight like Perth to Kalgoorlie will need to be powered by SAF, as these flights carry well over 100 passengers regularly. As part of HEFA ANZ's roadmap for sustainable flying, we modelled a number of potential pathways to net zero flying by 2050, and the graph on the left reflects simply one of these pathways. It's a point in time and one option out of thousands of potential assumptions and inputs. However, as you can see, SAF in the light green is going to be the single largest facilitator of the Australian aviation sector reaching net zero by 2050. And regardless of all the inputs and assumptions we run and all the scenarios that we modelled, that was true for each one. The graph on the right shows a global comparison of the anticipated impact of SAF in reducing emissions from residual jet fuel use, after accounting for reductions through fleet renewal and technological and operational improvements. So regardless of how you look at it, SAF is key, and so it's important to understand just how much we might need. As part of the analysis of our roadmap, we undertook modelling to estimate demand for jet fuel in 2050. At a baseline, with frozen fleet and no efficiencies, we'd be looking at jet fuel demand in excess of 20 billion litres by 2050. However, the more likely scenario, with around a 25 to 30% efficiency to baseline, results in 15 billion litres of jet fuel being required in Australia in 2050. And the analysis by ICF at the top right suggests that imports of jet fuel could be reduced to as little as 21% by 2050, or perhaps an even smaller proportion. Analysis from the CSIRO-SAF roadmap in the middle shows that Australia could potentially, with the right policy conditions, and as Catherine said, the current unrealised opportunities being fully utilised, produce enough SAF to meet almost 90% of its anticipated jet fuel demand by 2050. This obviously presents a major opportunity for Australia, but to see this potential realised, timely and well-designed policy at both the state and federal level will be critical. Whoops. It was excellent to hear from Minister Jarvis and Ms Shaw today about how the Western Australian Government is planning to support the decarbonisation of WA's major industries through the development of a low-carbon fuels industry. Similarly, we've seen encouraging moves from the Queensland Government and the New South Wales Government, with significant funding and policy commitments being announced this year. For a country like Australia, with a population that is so heavily reliant on air transport, it's important that a balanced and comprehensive policy framework is put in place to avoid a situation like we've seen in France, where the introduction of a mandate without any supporting policies resulted in SAF being prohibitively expensive, not available to all aircraft operators, and not produced in the quantities required to meet the mandate. As such, we've been really encouraged by the federal government's decision to explore both the demand and supply side policies to support and facilitate the production, supply and deployment of Australian-made SAF. The right policy framework will allow Australia to unlock not only significant private investment, but also major and wide-ranging benefits for the Australian economy and community more broadly. With our quantum of demand and supply potential, it makes sense for Australia to pursue domestic production of SAF. In a scenario where Australia becomes only a feedstock provider or exporter, as Minister Jarvis was talking about this morning, rather than an integrated local processor and SAF producer, we risk missing out on the significant benefits and opportunities presented by a local and regional bioeconomy. Similarly, it's now well understood that a domestic SAF industry will have a significant positive impact on Australia's domestic fuel security, safeguarding Australia's long-term sovereign refining capability and reducing Australia's reliance on imported fossil jet fuel and diesel, protecting against geopolitical risks, price shocks and supply chain issues. As James explained earlier today, there are immense economic and employment opportunities associated with a low-carbon liquid fuels industry in Australia. For example, we expect a domestic SAF industry alone to result in over 15,000 new jobs and an additional $7.5 billion in GDP annually. And our modelling indicates that states like Western Australia that are rich in feedstocks like oilseeds, residues and waste, and in the future green hydrogen, could capture up to 30% of that total opportunity. We spend a lot of time talking about new jobs from a low-carbon liquid fuels industry, but something that sometimes goes underappreciated, as James mentioned, is that a low-carbon liquid fuels industry will not only create jobs, but also maintain the current jobs across industries that are reliant on liquid fuels and industries that will provide feedstock for these fuels. I was up in Queensland recently meeting with parliamentarians as part of Bioenergy Australia's Renewable Fuels Meets Parliament campaign. It was a great opportunity to exchange ideas on how Queensland could capitalise on its natural feedstock advantage. I was joined by representatives from the maritime and trucking industries, and I know Mark and Angela are speaking on the program later, but we were also joined by representatives from the cane growing sector and the sugar milling sector, and listening to them talk, it became apparent that a domestic SAF industry could provide much needed security for the existing jobs in that sector. In speaking about the potential to safeguard jobs, it would be remiss not to mention Australia's visited economy that's facilitated by international flying. This is particularly important to Western Australia, given the current and future connections with the EU, the UK and Singapore, especially as travellers become more conscious of sustainability and the emissions profile of their flights. Last year, visitors from the UK and Singapore alone contributed almost $500 million to the Western Australian economy. So we're keen to see these connections maintained and strengthened with green travel lanes to and from countries with existing SAF mandates and markets. There's an opportunity for Australia to take a leading role in providing a SAF solution for our region. It was heartening to see that at the recent 2x2 ministerial meetings between Australia and New Zealand, there was a commitment from both governments to work together on the development of a regional SAF solution, recognising it's unlikely that New Zealand will be able to meet its demand for SAF alone. Australia becoming a renewable fuel superpower not only serves our domestic interests, but provides us with an excellent opportunity to collaborate with our neighbours across the Tasman and New Zealand and our partners in the Pacific to provide a regional solution for sustainable flying. I'll leave it there because I'm well over my time, but please don't hesitate to ask any questions during the panel discussion. Thank you.
Hi everyone. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Graeme Potger and I'm Head of SAF at the Qantas Group. So my day job is largely to set the Qantas Group's strategy around SAF and then try and figure out a supply chain and some offtakes to meet our 2030 target and beyond. So today I've been tasked to give you an overview of the airline's response to the growing push towards SAF. And I've been given 10 minutes to do it. So it's a pretty big topic. So being from an airline, I'm very committed to on-time performance. So this is going to have to be a pretty quick overview. But I really just wanted to touch 3 points. First, there was a couple of big, broad macro perspectives around some of the challenges we face, both in scale and commerciality. Second, I just wanted to give some demonstrable proof points that airlines are not just sitting on their hands waiting for production to come up. So we are hard at work at the other end of the value chain, doing what we can to sort of build the commercial structures we are going to need to absorb the premium. And third, because this conference is happening in WA, I just wanted to give a quick snapshot of what good may look like in this space, and building on Catherine from CSIRO's intro around mallee trees and converting that into SAF. I just want to give you a little bit of an update of what the progress we've made through that Wheatbelt Connect project. So quickly, I just wanted to start on this quote from Willie Walsh, who's the Director General at IATA, and the main point here was just that other speakers have said airlines is a notoriously low margin business, But for all the revenue that we can generate, and as an industry we are good at generating revenue, but the profit margins are very thin. And so, Willie made this point that really, when you look at it, the average profit per passenger across the global industry was something in the order of $5 or $6. So it's a cup of coffee that you could buy on the terrace now. So my call to action, I think, to the whole value chain as we sit here and we start seeing our part in it, is that we're really going to have to think outside of the coffee cup to make this thing commercial. Because when you look at the other energy vectors that are going through a transition, I think this one is unique in the sense that the end market and the end use here is consumers, and it's a discretionary product, and it's super elastic. So when you think of bolting an agro-economic model onto a production model, onto an airline model, I think we just need to be aware that there's got to be a lot of creative thinking to get this thing off the ground. The second point was just around scale. So IATA released a couple of roadmaps recently, one on policy and one on financing. I won't go through all the detail of it, but I just wanted to call out the headline number, which is kind of jaw-dropping when you think of the IATA's estimated cost for the airline industry globally to make the transition over the next 25 years. So their headline figure was something in the order of $4.7 trillion. And of that amount, they estimated SAF to make something in the order of about 80% of that amount. So at a global level, the challenge is monumental from a scale perspective, but it is going to require a lot of commitment and a lot of conviction. And I think someone else pointed to it before, but our 2050 target for us is, and that's just Qantas, is 3.5 billion litres of SAF. So that is quite a sizable amount. So faced with a commercial and a scaling challenge, where do you start? You can sort of get a little bit lost in where to begin. I think from a Qantas Group perspective, we started by setting a strategy. I won't go through it with in detail here, but we do have a 10% SAF uptake by 2030, which roughly equates to about 600 million litres. It is a moving target as our network develops, so we're going to need some flexibility trying to land that target, and I liken it to trying to land one of our jumbos onto an aircraft carrier, given it will be moving. The other one call out here is that we've also recently come out with a nature strategy, and that's deliberately put on this diagram because there is an interaction, as previous speakers have mentioned, potentially between SAF and nature positive outcomes. And I think my view is that SAF, expressed at its highest form, has as a feedstock strategy something that can produce a co-benefit around sustainability, nature positive outcomes, or fix up an environmental problem. So when you can design a project and a way of making SAF around that, we think that that's a really positive thing. So how do we begin this from an airline perspective? We're aware that the production side of things is up and going. We've heard from Brendan that policy is starting to develop. We've got to play our part as an airline industry. So we kind of look at it in terms of three domains. The government piece we've touched on before. We think that there's a role for Qantas and end users to be in the investment phase as well. And we've come together with Airbus with a $300 million development fund to deploy into Australian production. And also customers. We're taking a close look at what's happening around globally, and a lot of airlines are piloting some of the cost allocation mechanisms that I think are going to feature in part of the value chain. So just turning to government, I won't dwell on it because other parties or other speakers have talked about it, but obviously we've got the carrot and stick approach between America and the EU. We are looking at the EU mandate starting next year and how we're going to respond to it in terms of our commercial model. In more locally, Singapore's done a little variation on a theme, so they're going to have a mandate, but they're going to try to recover some of that through a levy applied at Changi, which is a nice way to level the playing field. But our in-house view is that we're going to need a suite of these policies, and I think other speakers have said that we firmly believe that. The two, in our real-world experience, seeing these policies in action across the globes, there's no panacea policy. Some of them, they all have, benefits and trade-offs. But the two demand and supply side policies working in conjunction in a way that's calibrated to local conditions, I think is really the key on the policy design. And I think from a Qantas perspective as well, we have probably been more vocal in the policy side of things that you would expect an end user to be. And largely that's because, there's one more step in the value chain here. So if you look at it versus fossil fuel, once fossil is combusted in the air, no one really cares about it thereafter, or people starting to care about it. But with SAF, you've got this extra step with your customers, whether it's corporates or passengers now looking at the sustainability attributes. And as an industry, I think we wear the greenwashing risk in and around SAF. So it is really up to us to wrap our arms around it and assume some responsibility and know what we're putting into the planes now. Just quickly, on the customer side of things, we are busy trying to raise awareness. So in our market surveys with our customers, there is very little penetration out there in terms of your average Joe around SAF. So there's a big piece of work there for the industry to lift education around SAF. The promising thing is that when we explain to our test audiences what SAF is, they intuitively realise its importance, and relative to carbon offsets, there's a sort of a 20-point lift in willingness to pay, which is encouraging for us. Just two other quick call-outs. So the Sustainable Fuel Coalition is a program and a platform we've developed now to businesses who want to reduce their Scope 3. So we issue SAF certificates to those corporates using a book and claim system so that they can start reducing their employee travel emissions. And that feature is going to be a really key part of the equation going forward. So we are a bit ahead of the rules here, but we thought it's such an important piece there, it's worth us pioneering. And the last piece is on the right side, we've also added a green tier part to our frequent flyer program, and largely that is to activate individual passengers around sustainability and sustainability choices. But it's a nice demonstration of the ecosystem that we've got here, that we can use the frequent flyer program to also magnify our sustainability efforts. And that's really what the approach we're trying to take, an ecosystem approach. This is just a quick snapshot around what is happening around the industry. So a lot of other airlines are moving in this space. Left side, there's a lot of customer actions happening. And even on the investment side, there's a lot of airlines directly investing into both projects, long-term offtake agreements and partnerships like the SAF Coalition. Am I out of time? Yeah, okay, I'm quickly just going to go through this. This will be my last slide. I think investing into infrastructure like this is not the natural space for an airline, but we think this mission is important enough to go where we wouldn't ordinarily go. And so recently we were in a consortium that invested into repurposed equipment out of the Marsden Point refinery in New Zealand. And that's just illustrative of the type of investment we're trying to make. And on the Wheatbelt Connect side, we've actually hit a really significant milestone in that we have, using that fast pyrolysis process, we have converted mallee trees and spotted gum into a pyrolysis oil and then actually upgraded it to on-spec SAF. So that is a real big breakthrough for us, and we are now looking at that system-wide supply chain for that project. But I'm going to stop on time because I've already delayed the flight.
G'day everyone, I'm Daniel, I'm the Head of Fuel and Aviation Decarb at Virgin. My principal role actually relates to everything related to fuel, and it's a team of me. I look after the conventional jet fuel but also the Sustainable Aviation Fuel. I won't spend too much time on this slide other than it's a slide we're all familiar with. SAF is widely recognised as a really important decarbonisation lever, and notwithstanding it's a really important consideration for us as well. The challenge, of course, is the availability of SAF, and so as we stare into that challenge and the challenge of decarbonisation, we're looking for opportunities to find ways to integrate SAF into our operations. And one of the ways to do that is through a chain of custody approach or book and claim or other approaches we can use. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes on this slide. We often talk about SAF and it rolls off the tongue really easily. SAF is a physical fuel which has an environmental attribute that's coupled to it. A physical fuel that has to meet quality standards through the ASTM process. It has documentation that's attached to it when it's produced, and it obviously has an efficiency of 100%. It also has an environmental attribute, so it has to be produced in a way that meets certain criteria in order for proof of sustainability to be attached. And then, of course, it reduces carbon emissions by up to 80%. So if we think about fuel or SAF as having a physical quality to it and an environmental attribute or an accounting process to it, we can really understand how we can account for the use of SAF in the supply chain. So I'll just draw again, I won't spend too much time on this. The fuel producers will be very familiar with this. As fuel is produced, it is batched, and as it makes its way through the supply chain, it receives its refinery certificate of quality, its certificate of analysis, and by the time it ends up in the airport, it's understood and it shows that it meets the specification. But that process doesn't talk to anything about the environmental attributes or the proofs of sustainability. If I think about SAF, again, a very similar supply chain, but you'll see that there's a proof of sustainability attached to it. And that is a combination of the aggregate sustainability considerations that go into making that fuel. So if we kind of stare into the challenge, and it's been raised a number of times, and we're all familiar with it, that currently the supply of SAF is small, but it's expected to grow. We see demand coming from both policy as well as voluntary targets that have been set. But also we see supply, and I'll show the next slide, there's a large amount of announced supply that will come online, and some of that will fall away. But what we're likely to see is actually a mismatch of production and demand, where the SAF will be produced and where it's required. And so there is an opportunity to think about meeting that demand with the available production in different ways. So I don't want to spend too much time on this slide again, other than to note that the majority of the production will be in the US and Europe, largely driven by policy. There are a few dots on the Australian slide, and hopefully that'll grow up and grow as we develop clearer policy in this country. But we can see there's likely to be a mismatch between demand and supply. So if you think about that chain of custody, so you recall those slides I showed earlier, when SAF was first being utilised by airlines and end users, there was a need to couple that environmental attribute with the physical fuel right through the supply chain. So if I think about it in a sort of a local context, SAF that's made in Perth is segregated, it's put into separate transport vehicles, it's put into separate storage tanks at the airport. Refueling vehicles will take that fuel out of the storage tank, put it into the aircraft, and it's a fully segregated model. The challenge with that is that's not what SAF is designed for. It's a drop-in fuel. It's fungible with conventional jet fuel. It doesn't need to be separated. And so therefore, there is an opportunity to decouple that environmental attribute from the physical fuel. So as we've become more confident with SAF and the way it's used and produced, we're now in a season of mass balance, and that is now where it's recognised the more efficient way to do it is to deliver it into an airport fuel system where an airline can purchase the environmental attributes associated with that fuel, but every airline that operates out of that airport will receive a small quantity of sustainable aviation fuel. That's by far the most common way in which SAF is being utilised. The next evolution of this thinking is the book and claim model. Now, I speak predominantly of the Scope 1 benefits here, but they're equally applied to Scope 3 benefits, is where actually fuel is delivered into airports where the customer doesn't actually operate. So if I think about it again in a local context, fuel that is delivered into Perth Airport from SAF that's produced in Perth is utilised by airlines that operate on the East Coast. Or, if I think about it, the next evolution of that is airlines that operate outside of our jurisdiction, so in the US, or Europe, or Japan. That requires a lot of work administratively to consider some of the challenges in respect of the way the ENGA and Safeguard, as well as the Article 6 provisions work. But it is recognised by industry as being by far the most optimal way to utilise fuel. The alternative to that model is that you're having to transport fuel around. That is obviously much more cost inefficient, but also environmentally inefficient as well. So book and claim is a way to remove the geographic constraint and create optimisations whereby the fuel or the fuel is produced in near locations where the feedstock is and is used in airports that are as closely located. But then the attributes or the benefits of that SAF can be sold broadly and not restricted to the airlines that operate to that particular jurisdiction. That's sort of isolating that a little bit. But fundamental to that process is actually the registry. How do we know that the SAF has been delivered? How do we know that the environmental attributes exist? And the establishment of a registry whereby the environmental attributes are uploaded, can be recognised, and then sold is really important, because the opportunity for fraud in something like this, and we've seen in other industries, is quite high. And so what IATA have done in consultation with industry is actually to establish 12 principles that preserve trust and confidence in the process. It's no different if I sort of think about it. I can pay someone with cash, and I have to go and pay that physically hand that bill over, or I can upload my cash into a banking system, and then that bank can take care of that electronic transfer for them. We have a trust in that process, and establishing a certificate registry is really important to ensure that we avoid things like double counting, double issuance, that we want to make sure that there is no potential for fraud in this space. When we establish something like that at a global level, we actually have the ability to trade and move around environmental attributes without having to be constrained by where the supply of SAF is taking place physically. Why is that really important? Well, obviously, if I'm a producer, I have access to a greater amount of supply. I'm not restricted to the customers that are in front of me. As an airline, I'm actually not restricted to the amount of suppliers that are in the market. There's a greater opportunity for market participation. There's also opportunities for airlines that wouldn't otherwise have access to SAF. And I think we think selfishly of Australia, and in many cases that can be appropriate, but there are other jurisdictions that are just as interested in using SAF that will never have the ability to produce it because of scale and other things like Pacific Island nations, and countries where the scale-up of SAF may not be the most efficient opportunity for them. So to leverage into systems like this, where Australia, and particularly states like Western Australia, can be a global producer of SAF, means that they have access to and can sell into a much broader market than would otherwise exist. Moving product around is not the best use of the resources that we have. So obviously there's a cost associated with it, but more importantly, an environmental challenge associated with it. And then there's that regulatory side, which I won't spend too much time on. Again, the opportunity for Australia is quite obvious in states like Western Australia. We have high quality feedstock. We have high quality world-class agricultural practice, which we've heard around already. How do we leverage that? And the opportunity to leverage that is to recognise the establishment of book and claim within the current safeguard mechanism that we have, and working with states outside of Australia, with ICAO and IATA in particular, to help unlock that challenge of Article 6 and other hurdles that prevent that from happening. And that's happening as we speak. We know IATA has recently established a SAF registry, which will be interoperable with some of the other things that are going on at the minute. I'll just stop there, noting time, but happy for you to ask any questions on the panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me here at the Low Carbon Fuel Summit. My name is James Williamson, and I work as the General Manager for Neste's Australian unit. Before we dive into the exciting world of fats and oils, because I know that's what you've all been waiting to hear about today, let me briefly introduce myself. So I've spent the last 10 years almost exclusively working with fats and oils inside the biorefining and biofuels sector. The first 5 years of that, I spent working as a feedstock supplier for a very large agricultural company, and the latter 5 I've spent focusing on primarily the refining supply chain at Neste. My wife sincerely tells me that I need a new hobby. So my intention today is to try and give you a very practical and commercial viewpoint on the fats and oils industrial pathway and its critical role in supplying a global SAF market. So jumping right into it, I'm going to walk you through a very short introduction to our company, Neste. We'll then spend some time looking through the various refining options when it comes to fats and oils specifically. I will then wade into some of the challenges we face in growing renewable fuel market, both here in WA and more broadly across Australia. It's not all bad news though. I will then share some of our recent successes locally as we embark on developing market access for renewable fuels in this region. There we go. For those unfamiliar with Neste, we are at the moment the world's leader in renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. With a global presence, we're turning renewable raw materials such as fats and oils into high quality renewable products using our proprietary NextBTL technology. We started this journey in 1948 as the state-owned oil and gas supplier of Finland, whom it's worth mentioning still today have a substantial stake in our business, about 44%. And over the last couple of decades, Neste has been transitioning its business from fossil fuels into producing renewable fuels from the 4 HEFA refineries you can see here, including our joint venture with Marathon Petroleum, spanning across Asia, Europe, and North America. There's often a lot of talk in our sector when it comes to transitioning. Sadly, often more talk than action, but I feel very proud working for Neste, as we are one of the few companies that has actually walked the talk, so to speak. Okay, so how do we take these fats and oils and transform them into something that could power a truck or a plane? Let's break it down. There are various technology pathways at different stages of development for the production of low-carbon liquid fuels, specifically SAF. And to be clear, if our collective ambition is to truly decarbonise hard-to-abate sectors such as aviation, we will need various pathways to get there. However, currently I would make the argument that for now, fats and oils represent the primary commercial method for producing SAF at scale. In this category, there are 3 main refining methods. Starting at the top, we have biodiesel or methyl ester. Biodiesel has been in production now for over 100 years, and it's worth mentioning that the Australia still has 3 active producers today. With respect to today's theme, its biggest downside is that unfortunately, as a standalone method, it does not allow for the production of SAF. And when it comes, and it also comes with a few additional trade-offs, namely that it carries over some of the cloud point properties of the feedstock, meaning that it often suffers from a blend wall or a maximum ratio that you can blend into conventional fuels. At the bottom, we have co-processing, summarizing rather crudely. Sorry for the pun, I don't get out much. The idea is that effectively you dribble a small amount of biogenic feedstock into a conventional refinery. Accountants love the idea of this method, as you immediately save the very substantial capex requirements in the need to build out a dedicated renewable refinery. But the hidden cost here is that, unfortunately, because your catalyst is not purpose-built to deal with waste and residues, you are sort of trapped into using the most expensive qualities of fats and oils, and you're effectively barred from a very large portion of the waste and residue pool. Further, unfortunately, the refining process is heavily reliant on the continued use of fossil crude oil, and generally, the biogenic content must be assigned in a relative proportion to the refinery's output. So for SAF purposes, jet kerosene or naphtha typically only represents about 6 to 8% of a standard refinery output, so it would only be 5% of that. Finally, in the middle, we have HEFA, which is us. We think HEFA is great. That's probably explains why we've built 4 refineries. In all seriousness, though, when it comes to fats and oils, this is the benchmark production method. Our fuels are drop-in, meaning that they run well in the same engines and utilizing the existing infrastructure of conventional fuels. So in effect, you save from the added expense of needing to build out a whole new supply chain. Due to the production process, HEFA fuels come with a higher energy density and a hydrophilic, meaning that they effectively have a substantially longer shelf life than the other fuels mentioned here. Furthermore, they are absent of aromatics, meaning that they burn cleaner for less particulate matter than conventional fuels. I have a photo for comparison on the next slide. So often they have very good application in areas where air quality is important, for example, underground mining or tunnelling. And best of all, this method can produce a large portion of SAF. In Singapore alone, we've recently added 1 million metric tonnes of dedicated SAF capacity. Okay, so the first question you're probably asking yourself is then, if these renewable fuels are so fantastic, why aren't they everywhere? Well, in Australia, we do face a number of hurdles which we're yet to overcome. This is a non-exhaustive list, and many of these issues could easily branch across several categories. Firstly, we are lagging many developed economies and not yet having adopted a standard for renewable diesel, which we desperately need. We are told by our friends at Bioenergy Australia and DECU that this is in the works, but until that time, this remains a point of friction. Next, we have the cost. Currently, the volume of renewable fuels that we ship to Australia or distribute here is relatively small. So on a supply chain, supply chain costs are higher than they ought to be on a unit basis, particularly when compared to conventional fuels. Further, we exist in a global biofuel market, so often the floor price of these fuels and feedstocks can ultimately be set in other countries abroad. And finally, by international standards, Australia at the moment benefits from a relatively cheap cost of carbon abatement in the form of ACCUs. So when it comes to meeting GHG obligations under frameworks such as the safeguard mechanism, let's face it, most businesses will probably go with the cheapest option unless there's a really good reason not to. Okay, so this next slide is probably going to get me into trouble. As soon as I found out that the conference was being held here in Perth, I knew I had to have a crack at New South Wales. I'm probably not going to be allowed back in, let's be honest. So for those who are not aware, New South Wales currently has a 2% biodiesel mandate. This is from a quick Google search that you can see I actually made earlier this week. If we want to be taken seriously as a country when it comes to biofuels, the first Google search result cannot be a guide on how obligated parties can exempt themselves from the scheme. It's as simple as that. New South Wales, to be fair, should be commended in being brave enough to establish a mandate. But I would propose that a poorly maintained mandate could be worse than not having one at all. It hurts credibility and hinders investment. Looking beyond Australia, to compete internationally, we need to ensure that Australia has access to the most affordable low-carbon fuels, which means that we need to meet global standards. As you can see, and has also been covered by various previous panelists, there are various frameworks for certification and policy standards which have already been established. Further, there are many lessons learned by our global neighbours when it comes to approaching low-carbon liquid fuels. Some have taken the path of an emission standard, while others have chosen a mandate. Some have gone with both. But look, despite these barriers, the good news is that we are seeing real progress in Australia and New Zealand. For example, the Royal Australian Air Force has already begun using SAF, as has Air New Zealand. And these aren't just niche applications, these are serious commitments to decarbonising aviation. On the ground, we've partnered with companies like Cleanaway to run heavy vehicles on renewable diesel. This kind of progress is vital because the more that we can show that these fuels work safely, efficiently, and at scale, the easier it becomes to expand their use. So if you have any questions after this session, or if you'd like to explore using SAF or renewable diesel in Australia, please come see me or reach out. Thank you.
Hello again. I didn't mention earlier that my day job is a regional director for LanzaJet in the Asia Pacific. So I thought I'd start by just a timely reminder of the urgency to act. So as many of you probably would have gathered from news of the recent weeks, Hurricane Helene in the Gulf of Mexico made landfall in Florida and cut a path kind of straight up through Georgia and the Carolinas. It went straight, basically, if you don't know, our first commercial plant, Freedom Pines Fuels, is situated right in central Georgia and was right in the path of the hurricane. So when it came through, it was still a Category 2 storm. We obviously had to shut down the plant to protect the asset and our people. And thankfully, everyone was safe and accounted for and there was no damage. But the damage to the surrounding community, which is a small rural part of Georgia, a town called Soperton, they were absolutely devastated. Our VP of Operations, this is his 9th hurricane, I believe, that he has lived and worked through, being a sort of veteran of the refining industry in the US. He also went through Hurricane Katrina. I'm sure a lot of you remember that. This was, in his view, the worst since then. And in the time since, just to sort of reinforce the point, in the time since me putting this slide together, we've seen Hurricane Milton, an even stronger storm, spin up and tear through Florida yesterday. So I think a really timely reminder, obviously we're seeing these weather events, the intensity and frequency of these weather events obviously grow and something we're not immune to here in Australia and very familiar with. That urgency to act, and we've heard this seen this from other speakers, so I won't labour the point, but that urgency to act is obviously driving an urgent need to decarbonise our economy and our hard-to-abate sectors, and obviously the task ahead of us is a very significant one, but one I'd say we think is certainly achievable, and we're seeing this, this industry, this SAF ecosystem, so to speak, emerge in other parts of the world where the key building blocks are coming together. And obviously a linchpin to all that, and we've heard a lot about this morning and we'll hear more about it today, is policy. So I'm not going to talk too much about that. I'm going to focus more on alcohol to jet, what the technology looks like, its role in scaling SAF production and some of the projects that we're working on around the world. So just a very quick primer on LanzaJet. So we see our role, part of our role is very much to support the development and lead the development of SAF industries around the world. We're a relatively young company, but very proud of what's been achieved in a very short period of time. So we were the first to market with an alcohol-to-jet technology. That technology was used to achieve ASTM certification for the pathway in 2018, and the fuel that we produced through that process was used for the first alcohol-to-jet commercial flights. We're now the world's first and only company to have funded, built, and now starting to operate an alcohol to ethanol to SAF plant. And now I know James mentioned HEFA being the primary commercial technology available for SAF production today. Well, I'd argue that alcohol-to-jet is here as well now. We know we can't do this alone, so we're really fortunate to have some great funders and supporters. I won't go through them, but we were essentially founded in 2020 by LanzaJet, Suncor, Shell, Mitsui and British Airways. For those that know the backstory here, and you can see, you can probably tell from the name, our technology was originally developed by LanzaJet in partnership with the US Department of Energy's Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. And so we were spun out in 2020 to scale and deploy the technology. And in recent months, we've welcomed a number of other investors to the business, including Airbus, Southwest Airlines, MUFG, Group ADP, and Microsoft. So this is what our technology looks like. I guess the key thing to understand is it was built from the ground up to produce SAF. So 90% of what we produce is sustainable aviation fuel, and the remaining 10% is renewable diesel. We don't produce any other light ends, so no naphtha or refinery gas. We can also, it's very flexible, so we can also operate the process to produce up to 75% renewable diesel and 25% SAF just through how we operate the operating conditions of the plant. The other great thing about the technology is its versatility in feedstock. So yes, we can absolutely, like the name suggests, process and convert first-generation ethanol into sustainable aviation fuel, but we can take just about any other feedstock outside of waste fats and oils, convert that into ethanol and ethanol into SAF. And we go about that through working with partners and integrating our technology with partners like LanzaJet. So LanzaJet have a process, if you don't know the technology, that converts basically waste carbon, whether it be municipal solid waste, agricultural residues, industrial off-gases, or direct air-captured CO2. They ferment that, they have a biological process that converts that into ethanol, and then we convert that into SAF. So the integration of those two technologies is what we refer to as circular. And about half the projects that we're working on around the world are integrated solutions deploying the combination of this technology to take wastes and residues all the way through to sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel. And so what that means is that pathway, the alcohol-to-jet pathway, is a very relevant technology that can be used can be deployed to convert all the feedstocks over the short, medium, long term that we talk about that are usually considered in the context of gasification and Fischer-Tropsch, or even power to liquids. So a bit more about our first commercial plant. So as I said in the opening, it's called Freedom Pines Fuels. It's located in central Georgia in a town called Soperton, a small rural part of the state. It's a commercial plant, a small commercial plant, so it production capacity of about 38 million litres of SAF and renewable diesel a year. 90% of that will be SAF for the most part, and 10% renewable diesel, and we'll be processing a variety of different ethanol through that plant. Where we're at the moment, we opened in January this year. We officially opened the facility, I guess, after we've completed construction. We had over 300 guests join us for that event, including the US Agricultural Secretary Tom Vilsack. In the time since, we've been working through commissioning and startup, and we're getting closer and closer and making good progress, and we should be starting to produce product in the near future. And when we do, you will certainly all know about it. So looking ahead, we're now active in 26 countries over 5 continents, and have announced several projects around the world, including several in the Asia-Pacific region, including up in Japan. We have a joint venture over in India with Indian Oil Corporation, and we've been working on some feasibility work with Air New Zealand, the New Zealand government, around residues and MSW over there. But here in Australia, we're really proud to be helping advance and supporting 2 key projects, I guess, first of their kind. So with Jet Zero up in North Queensland, developing Australia's first ethanol to SAF facility, and also in Queensland with Wagner Sustainable Fuels, developing a project that is that combined technology with LanzaJet to take municipal solid waste through to sustainable aviation fuel. So I'll leave that with you, and I'm looking forward to taking any questions on the panel. Thank you.
Yeah, so we'd like to take some questions from the floor. Any questions to start off with? Okay, maybe I'll just start off something. But yeah, I think we heard a lot about issues and stuff like that. But maybe I want to start off with probably the producers like Neste and LanzaJet. Like, I think one of the questions that has been answered with the presentation is that the feedstock issue, as in, will the supply be enough to really defossilize aviation as a whole, right? I mean, how do you guys see it?
Do you want to take the head?
Yeah, big question. So it depends on your time frame. At the moment, and this is sort of easy because we're still at the infancy of developing demand in this region, but with the 1 million tonnes of capacity that we added in Singapore, at the moment you could say within APAC there's more capacity to produce than there is demand. But with policies such as the Refuel EU, which I think was mentioned a bit earlier, or the Fit for 55, I think our sort of rough estimate for the 90% of airports that are captured as part of that, it equates to about 1.2 million tonnes of SAF. So that supply and demand equation changes very quickly. And as you go forward with some of the very ambitious targets that the likes of Qantas, One World and others have made in IATA, 10% of SAF, that's a huge volume. So short term, there seems to be supply. Longer term, it's going to be a challenge.
Nothing to add.
Okay. Yes, please. This gentleman here first.
Just a question on... Thank you. Just Boaz Kogan, Melbourne Feeds. Just a question on minimal scale of some of these plants. So obviously one of the big issues is the ability to accumulate biomass into an area. So for the different technologies, ethanol to SAF, HEFA to SAF, what's your minimal scale?
Yeah, so the plant, the Freedom Pines Fuels that I talked about, that's 38 million litres a year production capacity. Going forward, all the other projects that I mentioned that are sort of in development that were shown on that map are at least 3 times that scale, which is kind of the minimum scale we're talking about. So 113 million litres a year of production capacity. And then some of the projects in the US we're working on are even a step up from that again. But from a minimum deployable scale, that's kind of what we're talking about for our technology at least.
For HEFA now, when you're building a plant, you probably wouldn't want to go smaller than about 700 KT or 700,000 metric tonnes. Most of the ones that we see are at least 1 million plus. And you sort of, it sounds like a lot of tonnage, but then when you put it in context of a traditional oil refinery, so if we use Geelong or Lytton as examples, I think they're about 105 to 115,000 barrels a day. So those are considered sort of small to medium-sized refineries, and they're 5.5 million tonnes. So it sounds like a lot, and it is a lot of volume, but on the sort of global scale, especially when you want to start approaching that cost of conventional fuels, you do need, at least within HEFA, you definitely need that economies of scale.
Peter McBride from Cargill. A question for Graeme and Daniel. I view mandates as one of the key policy levers for SAF. Can you give us a view on how you see mandates or where they should be set and when?
Yeah, so I think a couple of real-world observations. I think in the countries where we've seen mandates apply, nothing drives behaviourally initial action like a mandate. So, for example, the Japanese set one, and then we saw Japanese conglomerates all moving through Australia instantly. So I think it is important. I think the step changes and the trajectory that you set it at has to just be commensurate with how you see production coming on. And so, James's map of Australia, there we agree with that in terms of the most credible projects at the moment. There will need to be an exercise there where you sort of marry that off, because there's no point getting too far ahead of it. I think, my own personal view is that from an airline perspective, taking SAF on is an economically irrational thing to do for such a low margin business. I think the only way we're ever going to do it is for us to all the ships to rise on the tide. So that's why we think it's an important part of the policy mix.
I'd probably just add to that and say that it'll all have to, the devil's in the detail, as they say. What does it actually look like? How does it interrelate with all the other policy that's being developed? SAF is really expensive, and sort of our observation and sort of market testing shows that SAF is the most expensive in mandated markets, and largely because of the penalty clauses that exist in those markets to encourage. So unlike the biofuel mandate that I think was mentioned before, where there is a sort of an easy opt-out in markets where SAF is mandated, there are some fairly substantial buyout clauses which provides a fairly significant economic incentive for suppliers not to subject themselves to that. And so Emma's already mentioned in France the very, very high cost of SAF, and then the ability to pass it on to the customer is either as a fuel supplier if they're the obligated party, or an airline is limited to the competitive landscape in which they operate. So it is a fairly difficult consideration, one that needs to be treated very carefully to avoid any sort of unintended consequences which have some fairly real economic impacts.
I was going to say, I can probably quantify some of those unintended consequences, specifically in the French example with Air France and KLM, having to put a levy on tickets from between €8 to €48 per ticket to help them fund the cost of that SAF mandate that I was talking about. So that's why I think everyone over here is so aligned in the need for a balanced policy framework, and that's why we're so supportive of what the federal government is currently looking at with regards to those supply and incentive side policies.
Right, with that, I would like to ask as well, and then, okay. Oh, sorry, is there a question? Go ahead, please.
Sorry, Dave Evans, Defence Science Technology Group. I just want to make a quick statement because the term SAF's being used incorrectly throughout the whole forum, and let me just define what I mean. So what a producer such as Neste or LanzaJet make, they make a synthetic blending component. It is not drop-in, it is not SAF. It's only SAF once it's blended with a conventional jet fuel that is then certified. At that stage, it becomes SAF. All the other, and when we see demonstrations of neat drop-ins, of neat synthetics going in, they are non-approved fuels. They are only for trial purposes, and they need OEM-specific approval. They're not actually SAF in how we're referring to it. So I just want to put a word of caution out. That's my ASDM hat coming on there. So just be very careful on how we word it, and it's very important that we talked about greenwashing before, and I think we need to make sure that we get our terminology correct the whole way through. But leads to my next question, is that we see a whole lot of projections, and you see different things like powder liquids coming in, and all our projections out to 2050 require a lot of different technologies. So one of the issues we have is now not all these technologies that we're seeing in all the projections are actually teed up to provide a fully synthetic jet fuel. So how do we, in Australia, if we want to reduce the amount of reliance on fossil and we want to move to a fully synthetic jet, how do we encourage or entice that technology development in Australia and to be able to push it through an ASTM process?
So you're talking about the whole branch of e-fuels, yeah, powder liquid. So I think when we look at it, there's a big opportunity there. I think when you study the world and the regions that are most suited for e-fuels, you probably end up thinking about the Middle East, Texas, Chile and Australia, and that's the amount of solar radiation we get. We've also got, obviously, a national focus on green hydrogen, and we have got large source of industrial CO2, often in remote locations. So we've got the right attributes. Our experience has been that people in those respective domains are pretty focused on their bit, and so largely our part has been going around to them and saying, have you thought about the opportunity of e-fuels here? And one example, I'm not sure if Martin's in the room from Sun Cable, but we were talking to them about potentially some power out of their project for an e-fuel pilot. But I think the development of that, it is prohibitively expensive at the moment, but I think with the rates of learning you need to get one of those input pieces down to a bit more to the marginal cost to bring the overall cost of an e-fuel SAF to something within the ballpark where we can absorb it through the value chain. But WA is an obvious example. I know the South Australians are very interested in e-fuels, and I think their government is really focusing on that because they've got limited biomass there. So it's definitely on our radar. We're trying to find the right configuration and the right location for those attributes to do a first pilot.
I'll probably just say as well, I think powder liquid is absolutely seen as critical to the decarbonisation journey using SAF. I think the important thing is never to let sort of perfect get in the way of good, which is getting the available technology in front of us up and running to create that momentum, which will then drive that development research into bringing the cost down. It is the most expensive way to produce SAF. There are other ways, but as we progress, as we're able to innovate, that cost should come down, and that'll be a realistic way to integrate SAF into the operation.
And I think, like Brendan was saying earlier today, that's the themes that have come through in the low carbon liquid fuels consultation that industry's been responding to, looking at what incentive can we use now to stimulate production and supply and uptake, and then how can we support nascent technology that needs a bit of an extra helping hand or a bespoke solution. So I think that's definitely been considered and worked through, and I'm looking forward to seeing what we come up with.
I'll just add, I agree with your terminology. It's one of my bugbears as well, by the way.
Yes, please.
I was really interested in Flyn's feedstock about municipal waste. How far off is that technology in scaling up? Because in the earlier sessions, it seemed like we're limited to our feedstocks if we're looking at just relying on agriculture.
Yeah, so municipal solid waste, I think is an interesting feedstock. It's complex, obviously, because its composition, its variability, all that sort of stuff. So we work closely, obviously, with LanzaTech on that, and the project we're working with Wagner Sustainable Fuels in Queensland is deploying a technology to gasify that MSW, turn that syngas into ethanol and then into SAF. And importantly, it's built off deploying existing commercial available technology, particularly on the gasification side. So for those familiar, there's been a lot of waste gasification to fuels projects around the world. Unfortunately, not a lot be successful. But working with LanzaTech, the advantage of their process being biological is it can handle a lot of the swings and variations in the gas that you produce from gasifying MSW, because it's very adaptable. Whereas a Fischer-Tropsch technology, right, has far less ability to do that. You need a very clean syngas with impurities in the parts per billion levels, so you don't poison your catalyst. Whereas LanzaTech's process with being biological can handle a lot more of that. And then the other advantage in terms of what we're deploying is the gasifier is a proven commercial gasifier that's been used in Japan for many years to gasify MSW at scale for their electricity markets. So, and that gasifier actually requires far less pre-processing of the MSW on the front end as well, which is another added challenge when it comes to MSW.
Just to follow up on the question on municipal solid waste, sorry, Luke Ellery from Genesis Technip Energies. With the sort of transition towards the FOGO sort of a system, is there any further opportunity there because it's already segregated, generally less than 9 or 6% contamination and already going? Otherwise, at the moment, the plan is anaerobic digesters and making compost. Is there opportunity instead to say, actually, it's better off as fuel?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so the thing about FOGO is if you consider that feedstock is actually very high in moisture, right? You put that in a gasifier, you're just having to burn off water, so it's actually not very efficient. So those feedstocks, we would argue, are still better suited for anaerobic digestion. what you want is the rest of the material that's going to landfill, the carbon-based dryer fraction, so timber, textile, plastic, to some extent paper, cardboard, etc., that hasn't been recovered for recycling first. So there is absolutely, I see a role for those different technologies and the segregation of waste at the curbside. The other thing I'd just argue on MSW, there is a limit to MSW. We've only got so much of it, and yes, there may be some growth in it with population growth, but obviously with state government policies, there is a waste hierarchy, right, and an absolute. So ultimately, we're trying to get to less waste into landfill. So if we consider what we're trying to do with decarbonise a hard-to-abate sector, it begs the question, where is the greatest use for this limited feedstock we have? And so obviously I think our strong view, and I think probably a lot in this room, is it's not for, it's not a great use to be incinerating it to produce electricity, and a far greater use would be using it to convert that into sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel for our hard-to-abate sectors.
Any other questions?
It's one quick question. It's Richard Harper from Murdoch University. I'm wondering if the panel members have done any analysis around competitive effects. So global population's increasing, demand, sort of indications that global food demand might double by 2050, and the biofuel's going to require both transition of land use to non-food products, and also you've got the direct competitive effects from using foodstuffs for alcohol and fats. I'm just wondering if the panel's done any analysis around the competitive effects if the aviation industry does want to become sort of emissions neutral by 2050.
We're aware of the issue. Like, I think in the early days, it's quite easy to say that our initial idea is that it's all about coexisting, so you get food and fuel rather than displacement and food or fuel. But to your point, when you take a longer time frame and you've got population growth overlays to it, I think we would probably rely on our friends at CSIRO to help us out in that sort of analysis. But we are very sensitive. We're a consumer-facing organisation at the end of the day, so we don't want to attract that sort of criticism on ourselves. So we'll probably need help in that analysis if anyone's offering.
I'll probably just add as well, I think there are international sustainability criteria that have been established to help work through some of those challenges, and certainly as policies developed around the world, they do take that into consideration around ensuring that food is not displaced to create fuel, and so those are taken into consideration, how it sort of interplays with the growth in demand.
Just to add to what Daniel's saying, so obviously for any of these fuels that we're producing, they, in most cases, to sell them to an airline, it needs to be a CORSIA eligible fuel. And the certification against CORSIA does take into account, and through the life cycle assessment, does factor in indirect land use change and penalise for feedstocks that could result in some form of indirect land use change as well. So it is factored in, and there is a performance, I guess, a performance there to direct or value feedstocks. Put greater value on feedstocks that have far less of that risk.
Maybe one thing I'll add, because it's been covered quite well. So food versus fuel, it comes up all the time. It's certainly a consideration. You see it in a lot of the policies, particularly within the RED 2, now 3 policies, or the Renewable Energy Directive, which is the European-based policy, where they're putting hard caps on what are considered to be traditional agricultural crops. So it's definitely being recognised. I sat at a conference not long ago and I was listening to one engineer talk about food as sort of being on what they call an energy gradient, where he talked about the cost of a packet of cereal and the input cost, and this may be not exactly accurate, so I take it with a grain of salt, what 40% of that input was just the energy to make it. So he sort of talked about how even on the food side, there is a huge amount of energy that's required, and so there's optimization that needs to happen within fats and oils. We have seen a lot of traditional oil refiners looking at crushing, say for example, soybean, the consequence of that has been that there's been a lot of protein meal that's been produced. So it will come down to the policy mechanisms. They need to account for it, definitely, but it's probably not a straight line either, that it's one or the other, and I think that's sort of what was echoed here.
Yeah, it's quite a nuanced conversation, because in some countries there is a very delicate balance between the feedstock that's used to make food and its potential to make fuel, whereas in other countries, like Australia in particular, we do have excess crops, oilseed crops, that are shipped overseas today to make renewable fuel. So there is that. It's quite a nuanced and location-specific conversation, and hence why those policies, both domestically and internationally, kind of need to make that consideration and allowance.
Okay, I think that would conclude our session for today. Yeah, we can break for lunch right now. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.